Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm Jon Macri, and today we're wrapping up our 2024 rankings on the offensive side of the ball by looking at the tight end position. And joining me to help sort through it all, PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Just had the Scott Fish Bowl this past weekend. I've been doing some mock drafts this week, writing several articles every day. So for me, it feels like we're already full swing into things into fantasy season. I know most people won't have their normal drafts for another month or so from now, but I'm like, it's time. We're here. Let's go. Like 3 weeks till the Hall of Fame game, something like that.
Yeah. No, it definitely feels like full on fantasy season at this point. Like most drafts are not for another month. I have at least one going on right now, like a slow draft, and it takes at least a month, right, to prep for the 2024 season. So, getting through all these rankings and stuff like that, where that's kind of the reason why we're doing it right here, near well, I guess we're in July now. Yeah, in July. I was going to say the end of June. I'm losing my mind with time already. But yeah, it's going to come fast, right? So that's why we're going through all these rankings. We went through quarterbacks, we did running backs, we did wide receivers last week. So we're going to break these tight ends down into smaller groups based on our consensus rankings, like we did with those three positions, and take the average of mine and Nate's ranks and see where we differ, which players were higher and lower on than each other, and then of course compared to ADP as well. So for reference, we're going to be using Sleeper's updated 1QB ADP as of July 10th, which is today. So let's get right into it. Our consensus top five here. There aren't too many major differences from ADP in this range. So we'll start right at the top. Our tight end 1 is Sam Laporta of the Detroit Lions, and tight end 2 is Travis Kelce of the Taylor Swift Boyfriends. So nothing different from ADP there. At tight end 3, we both have Mark Andrews, who is tight end 4 in ADP. And then tight end 4 for us is Trey McBride, who's going as tight end 3 in ADP. So this is kind of our first discrepancy here in our rankings, Nate, though not a huge one. You have him as tight end 4. I have him as tight end 5. So 2 spots lower than consensus for me, I guess. But you're closer to consensus for McBride than I am. So we'll let you kick off the argument for him to be here. And then I'll explain why I'm also a little bit lower than him as well.
Yeah, I think for me, the big thing is just comparing Mark Andrews to Trey McBride. If you look at a number of other ADP sources, it's flipped a lot of different places, pretty even split. Some have Andrews higher, some have McBride higher. I'm personally fine with either one. I think some of it has to do with how risky you want to be with Trey McBride only having the 1 year sample size. Really a good play. So I think he's kind of the more exciting option because there's a chance he does a lot better this year and can improve from where he's at. Where Mark Andrews, we know exactly who he is, and he's been a top 6 tight end in fantasy points per game each of the past 5 seasons. There's very few players at any position that have had that kind of consistency these past 5 years. McBride did grade a little bit better, so that kind of goes in his favor. But the big thing for me is that the Cardinals drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. McBride had the highest targets per run last year. And I think it's going to be harder for him to repeat that. I think Harrison's going to take a lot more targets than the wide receivers in Arizona we're seeing last year. That even a couple percentage point decrease in target share should be enough to put Andrews ahead of McBride.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what it is for me, right? Like, I mean, he's 2 spots lower than that tight end 3 ADP for me. But like, to be clear, I obviously still really like Trey McBride. I think he's going to be a big part of the offense in Arizona this year. I just don't think, like he's the number 1 target earner on the team anymore with them bringing in Marvin Harrison Jr. Like, those were kind of the tiebreakers for me, and why I have like another tight end even as my tight end 4 ahead of McBride, who we'll talk about here shortly, is just that as much as I think, top 5 perfectly fine spot for McBride, I think there's, a good chance that he sees a dip in targets this year where, I don't have that concern necessarily for players like Mark Andrews or Evan Ingram, for example. So McBride also 0.8 red zone targets per game for the year, just an increase to 1 per game with Zach Ertz out of the lineup. There were a lot of other tight ends who saw better utilization than that in those, high scoring chance areas of the field. And again, it's probably why he also just had the 3 touchdowns all of last year. I think, part of that too is just being like an average offense, as good as Marvin Harrison Jr. and Kyler Murray are. I still think they probably rank around like league average at best if we're looking at the 32 teams as a whole. So how much of those scoring chances are going to increase for McBride? I don't know. Plus, Marvin Harrison Jr. probably going to take some as well. So I'm just not totally convinced that he's going to improve in any kind of like dramatic fashion or anything like that with touchdowns. Also being such a big part of tight end scoring, I just weighed that a little bit more into the couple of players I have ranked ahead of him. Again, still tight end 5, but he's in that larger kind of tier two pool of tight ends for me this year for fantasy, where the guys at the very top of that tier 2, Mark Andrews, who arguably is tier 1, should be tier 1 maybe, and Evan Ingram, I think have just a much better chance of leading their team in targets and receiving production this year.
Sure. And just to play a little bit of devil's advocate with Mark Andrews, there is Isaiah Likely, who has played well in Andrews' absence. There's a chance Likely starts seeing a little bit more playing time and Andrews a little less. And there is also a chance Andrews doesn't score as much touchdowns with Derrick Henry at running back. There's a chance that they start using Henry more than they were their past running backs near the goal line, especially. So there's a chance we see Andrews see a decrease from where he's been at, which is why I think Sam Laporte and Travis Kelce, there's a pretty big gap between them and the second tier of tight ends. But still, like you were saying, we aren't expecting McBride to score a ton of touchdowns either. So
yeah, that's the thing. Like I have Laporte and Kelce in tier 1, and Andrews, like I just kept going back and forth on him. ADPs, there's a bigger gap there between Laporta and Kelce and Andrews as well, like for when he is tight end 3, a round or so. So it does make sense. It definitely stuff that you got to factor in there for Mark Andrews this year as well. Our consensus tight end 5 is Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. He's going as tight end 5 in ADP as well. So nothing like overly noteworthy to discuss there, which takes us into the back half of our top 10, which starts out with my tight end 4, Evan Ingram. Nate, your tight end 8, ADP's tight end 8. So for me, obviously it appears I am much higher on Ingram than consensus, and I'll kind of get into why that is. And I guess one thing that really stood out to me with Ingram from last year, and I think has just as good a shot as happening again this year, is that he did lead all tight ends in targets last season with 140, 7.9 per game, which was second behind only TJ Hawkinson, who didn't play the whole year. There was also Calvin Ridley on the team last year, who played every game and commanded 132 targets himself. Ridley's gone. I don't think there's another player on that team in Jacksonville who's commanding 130 targets in 2024 other than Ingram. Ingram, pretty much everywhere you look too, like for tight end target projections, whether it's with us, Mike Clay, CBS, whoever, like has Ingram top 2 among tight ends in projected targets again this year. So for me, tight end 8 feels low as far as ADP goes. Maybe tight end 4 is high, but if he leads the team in targets again this year, which I think he has the best shot of anyone in Jacksonville, top 5 feels like it is in the cards for him again. And, the other thing with Calvin Ridley being gone is it opens up a ton of red zone targets for Ingram as well, because Lawrence loved Calvin Ridley in that area of the field last year. He targeted him 25 times in the red zone last year, which was by far the most on the team, but also tied for the 3rd most in the entire league last year. So if Ingram, who I think is, again, the best bet to absorb those opportunities, even takes on like half of what Ridley got in the red zone last year, like it's a pretty significant bump in his fantasy production potential. For a player who already finished as the PPR tight end 4 with just 4 touchdowns in 2023. So, I'm looking at him at tight end 8. I know he's not the sexiest option there, but to me, like, I think he is a value at that cost right now, and why I kind of moved him into this top 5 for targets and potential increased scoring opportunities alone.
Fair. I do like your point on the touchdown opportunity there. I think that will be important for him this year, and if he's able to score more touchdowns, that will be huge for him. For me, a big part of tight ends is I think tight end is the position in fantasy where a player's talent at receiving most closely resembles where they are in fantasy, because teams aren't going to have 2 excellent tight ends. We very rarely, if ever, see that happen. Where a running back, if you have a talented running back, if you have just one of them, that's great. But the second you have a second one, that decreases both of their fantasy value a ton. So we see this consistency at tight end that we don't see at other positions. Travis Kelce consistently among the top 1 or 2 tight ends each year. We've seen George Kittle consistently top 6. We've seen Mark Andrews consistently top 6. Hawkinson the past 3 years has been in that category as well. A couple years ago it was Darren Waller who was consistently getting there. And you don't see that as much at other positions, like running back. It's only Christian McCaffrey who's been year after year. And then you see someone in the top 6 one year, then they drop down, maybe they drop back up again. But so for me, I'm concerned about the talent with Ingram compared to some of the other tight ends. He is our 14th highest graded tight end at receiving over the past 2 years, below some guys like Gerald Everett, Cole Kmet, David Njoku, Pat Freiermuth, Jake Ferguson, all guys that we have lower on our list than Ingram. And then for me, part of the concern as well was last year, a lot of his great games occurred later in the season when Christian Kirk was out with an injury. So his fantasy points per game increased dramatically once Kirk was out, since Jacksonville's offense, we like to think of offenses kind of simplistically of like, here's the slot guy, here's the outside guys. And a lot of offenses, we see guys move around a lot, but Jacksonville is a little bit more on the simplistic side of like, you always see Kirk and Ingram as the 2 inside receivers. Last year it was Ridley and Zay Jones whenever he was healthy, but a bunch of other receivers on the outside. So I'm not sure if he will absorb or too much of those outside targets, since they did add Gabe Davis, who has been decent at scoring touchdowns. I'm not sure how much of a red zone threat he'll necessarily be, but that's one of the stats that he has stood out in. So I wouldn't be surprised if the outside targets kind of stay the outside targets, the inside targets stay the inside targets. And when Kirk went down, then Ingram absorbed all of those inside targets, and now Kirk will be back. So I believe he was averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game with Christian Kirk last year. Similarly, 10.4 fantasy points per game the previous year. So kind of coincidence that it was exactly the same, but that puts him right around tight end 8 in terms of fantasy points per game production. And then there's also the fact that he is turning 30. We do see receivers around that age start to decline a little bit, which Ingram has done a lot better in terms of his fantasy production than his real life production in terms of at least PFF grade. So I'm not as concerned about his age, but it's at least a factor in my consideration as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And yeah, it's not even that I'm necessarily like expecting Ingram to, absorb like the outside targets or anything like that. But I do think like Christian Kirk has a chance to play a little bit more outside this year. We saw him, kind of start his career a lot more outside as well. And with, Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr., kind of these inconsistent options, I'm not like overly sold on those guys kind of being immediate, impact players every single week in Jacksonville too. So I think, Kirk and Ingram being the kind of consistent pieces in that offense is kind of what I'm banking on here. And then obviously Ingram, even still with Kirk, with Ridley in the lineup, like still getting such a high target rate per game with Trevor Lawrence at quarterback is going to be a big part of it. And especially hopefully in the red zone as well. So yeah, we'll see how that one plays out. Obviously, this is not, they're all guys that I have in my like second tier here, but Ingram, obviously I do have a little bit higher in that second tier just because of that potential to lead his team in targets. So we'll see if he can do that again.
Yeah. And I will note, like, the touchdown thing is huge since his fantasy production has been completely volume in the past. He's scored 4 touchdowns last year, 4 the year before that. Hasn't scored more than 4 touchdowns since his rookie year where he scored 6. So if he's able to score another 2-3 touchdowns, that by itself would be huge for him.
Yeah, for sure. All right. And then tight end 7 for each of us is Kyle Pitts. He's going as tight end 6 in ADP. And then we get another potential discrepancy here with our consensus tight end 8, George Kittle. He's going as tight end 7. Nate, you have him as tight end 6. I have him as tight end 8. So we're each one spot higher and one spot lower than ADP. So tell me the case for Kittle here, and then I guess I'll explain why I'm like just slightly lower.
Kittle, for me, I think he's going to do basically exactly what he's done the past several years. He's ranked among the top 6 fantasy tight ends in fantasy points per game. Each of the past 6 years, Travis Kelce is the only other tight end to do that. Christian McCaffrey only other player at any other position to do that, and that's if you're pretty generous on the games played threshold with the seasons where McCaffrey was injured. But Kittle just has been very good in terms of PFF grades production. He was our second highest graded tight end last year in terms of receiving grade, behind Travis Kelce. If you look at the past 2 years, the past 3 years, anytime you add another year to it, it's still Kelce number one, Kittle number two. And then the gap between Kelce and Kittle is relatively small compared to the gap between Kittle and everyone below that. And you have to go back, I think 2012 is when I finally found someone in that range, and Rob Gronkowski was finally grading as good as those two. But he has just throughout his career been so good on a per play basis, and then just held back because he's in the 49ers offense that is more run heavy than basically any other team. So he's not running as many routes as all of these other tight ends, but he's continues to be very efficient. And then recently it's been the addition of Brock Purdy that's really helped his game as well, because he's been able to get big plays. He's graded well whenever he's run deeper targets, and Jimmy Garoppolo was just not able to get him those passes, and Brock Purdy is. And he's also been used in the red zone a little bit more. So for me, he's been in the top 6 every year. So I kind of expect the same from him. It's not the most exciting thing because he's just done it year in and year out, and he still has that cap on his upside because the 49ers like to run the ball so much, but that has been true every other year of his career.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. He's amazing. Arguably, arguably one of the best tight ends, or maybe the best tight end in the NFL. Probably carries more NFL value than actual fantasy value, even though the fantasy value is still amazing, right? But yeah, I'm with you. I think part of it too, like for me, just knocking him down a little bit, just expecting a little bit more regression here as getting a little bit older in that run heavy offense. 5.6 targets per game last season, ranked tied for 11th with Jake Ferguson. Ferguson saw slightly more red zone targets per game, but he had a 1,000-yard season last year. He was amazing. And a lot of that was kind of dependent on what he did after the catch as well. 7.3 yards after catch per reception. That was top 5 at the position. But when I was looking at, correlation for yak per reception for the tight end position, it didn't really correlate very strongly at all. So I do worry about that for a player who is now 30 years old, that we maybe get a little bit natural regression there, but not so much that he's like outside my top 10 or anything, but just enough that I'm just slightly lower than his ADP, I guess. It is right in that range. And these guys are all, going to come off the board one after another here, the Kittles, the Pitts, and, even Engram in that spot. So one of those 3 guys I'm very happy to get for sure.
Yeah, and this is like generally the range that I am happy to get a tight end. I've been kind of okay recently waiting because there are a couple of players that I'm fine waiting on. Like last year was like, I need this one player to be here, and if not, then I am much worse off at tight end. But knowing that I can get Kittle or Pitts or Engram all around that range, that's made me feel a little bit more okay not drafting one of those elite tight ends, because I don't think the gap between the guys we just talked about, Kittle, Pitts, Engram, is that large compared to Kincaid, McBride. It just Kincaid and McBride have that. They're very young. They're exciting. They were high draft picks. They could be this huge player where we know a lot more about who Engram and Kittle, who are both 30 RS players, and then Pitts is more of a projection that people are concerned about because of what's happened the past couple of years.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like it's probably the deepest it's been in recent years, the tight end position, as far as like potential high end scorers go. So you got to love that, and waiting on these guys into the later rounds is, I think, a perfectly fine strategy for the position now, because we're going to get some decent production out of all these guys. So including a couple that round out our top 10 here. We both have David Njoku as our tight end 9, and we both have Jake Ferguson as our tight end 10. So each of those guys are one spot higher than their current ADP. And that leads us into our next 5 players, with our consensus tight end 11 being Dallas Goedert, and our consensus tight end 12 being rookie Brock Bowers, who is going as tight end 9 according to Sleeper's ADP. So Nate, we're a bit lower on Bowers than that. I have him as tight end 12. You have him as tight end 11. So why don't you start with what the hesitation is to kind of fully embrace Bowers among the top 10 because we just saw a rookie tight end finish as tight end 1 last year, right? With another one who did finish in the top 12 as well. So people are starting to believe in the rookie tight end again. So tell us why Bowers, at least we need to maybe temper expectations slightly.
For me, one part is Michael Mayer still being on the team. He was a top 35 draft pick the year before and played significant playing time, and he is very good at being a well-rounded tight end. He can run block. That's a lot of what he was used for last year, and then slowly but surely getting used more as a receiver last year. And like I just did last week, a study on utilization for running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and the roles that they play in the offense. And for tight ends in particular, how much harder it is if you are not the primary early down tight end for a team. If you're just in 2 tight end sets and just playing on third downs, then you're still not going to be scoring nearly as many points as the other tight ends. So part of it is the concern about Mayer, and then part of it, just comparing him to the guy that I have directly ahead of him, but ADP has reversed, Jake Ferguson. Like in terms of competition for targets, they both have a top tier wide receiver on the team. Devontae Adams, yeah, he's getting a little older, not playing as well, but he's still seeing that target share. Both have a pretty decent wide receiver too. Brandon Cooks, Jacoby Myers. So that's, you can argue one or the other, but still they're both going to be decent wide receiver 2s on their teams. Not much wide receiver depth after that. Not going to see a lot of competition for targets from running back, but if I have the option between the two, give me the one who graded fairly well last season and is catching passes from Dak Prescott compared to the quarterback situation with the Raiders. So that, for me, that's a huge part of it, is if I wait at tight end and I'm trying to get a young guy with high upside, even though Ferguson, we've seen a little bit more from him, I'd much rather have Ferguson this year.
Yeah, that's the thing for me as well. Like I love Brock Bowers as a prospect, but you just look at this offense as a whole. Like we talked about our love for Devontae Adams last episode when going over the wide receiver ranking. So obviously big believers in him kind of dominating the targets in Las Vegas. But like I mean, I guess there's definitely a chance, right, that he emerges as the second best option on the team. Like I'd probably give him maybe that edge in year 1, but he has competition there, like you said, with Jacoby Myers. And then at the tight end position, Michael Mayer is going to find his way to get on the field as well. But like, it's just really, like you said, the offense as a whole with whether it's Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell at quarterback, like I don't think it's a good enough offense to kind of lift the value of Bowers into that top 10 at the position. Like I think, tight end for fantasy has definitely really improved, like I said, this year, going into this year as well, and Bowers can be a part of that. But I just find myself liking some of the other assets a bit better, like a Jake Ferguson, like you said. And a lot can change, right, from this year to next, and I'm sure it'll be for the better for Bowers, which is why for Dynasty, I think he's still an elite option and can push to be even top 5 if his quarterback situation improves next year. And, he flashes that potential this year and he has one of those, big years as a rookie, or at least in spurts where we start to get it hopeful again. But for 2024, at least I'm just kind of tempering expectations a bit, and why he's like tight end 12 for me.
Yeah, and I think it's worth thinking how risk averse you want to be, how risky you want to be. If you're looking at who has the best odds of being the overall tight end 1 this season, I would probably say Bowers has better odds of being the overall tight end 1 this season than Jake Ferguson, even though the odds are both fairly small for both players, because we still have Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, who have much better odds of being tight end 1, and you go down the list. But if you are hoping to get tight end 1 value this late in the draft, then maybe Bowers is the guy. But I just think all the ranges of possibilities of what could happen for tight end, there are a lot more good outcomes for Ferguson than there are Bowers.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it for sure. After Bowers, it is TJ Hawkinson, who obviously you talk about risk adversity. He comes with significant question marks that having that late season ACL tear. We're right in line with consensus, Nate, at tight end 13. Probably not too much to get into here. Obviously, if he's fully healthy, he's comfortably inside that top 12. And if it comes out that he's going to miss time at the start of the year, then, he probably falls a bit further down this list, right? We just don't know for sure yet. So we could save that conversation until we know more. But that takes us into our consensus tight end 14, Pat Freiermuth. I have him as tight end 14, and you're in line with ADP at tight end 16. So I'll make the case here for Pat. And I talked about it in the bounce back episode a few weeks ago as well. I like him quite a bit for this season. Like, obviously, 2023 sucked for Freiermuth. He was essentially a non-factor in that Steelers offense. He had finished as the PPR tight end 7 in 2022, where he earned 96 targets, 723 receiving yards. That dropped pretty significantly, 44 targets, 308 receiving yards last year, just 6.4 fantasy points per game, finished as the PPR tight end 30 through his 11 games last year. Like that, they just didn't use him at all, right? Outside of the one game, I think it was, where he finished as like the tight end 1 that week. It was just the abnormality compared to the rest of his season. But 15.9% target rate, that wasn't anything special, especially considering, again, the year prior, he was involved pretty heavily in that offense, 22.1% target rate, and posted 8 games where he had more than 3 receptions, where we just weren't seeing that from him last year on a weekly basis. And, I think for me, like, one of the biggest reasons that I'm kind of hopeful for him is Arthur Smith coming in as the offensive coordinator. I like the Falcons' tight end usage, even though it didn't work out for Kyle Pitts. I like that transferring to Pat Freiermuth and the Steelers a little bit more. So Arthur Smith's Falcons ranked top 3 in the NFL in overall target rate to the tight end in each of the past 3 seasons. They ranked first in 2021 and 2023. And again, it didn't work out for Kyle Pitts, but I think there's a clear difference between the two players and how they're utilized, because Freiermuth, much more of a traditional kind of inline tight end, which was more utilized in Arthur Smith's offense, as his teams ranked 3rd in tight end target rate from an inline alignment since 2021. And that was something that Kyle Pitts just rarely did for Atlanta, right? Just 29.5% of his snaps came from an inline alignment since 2021, where Freiermuth was up closer to 68% of his snaps from that alignment. And then you add in, like, again, Deontay Johnson not being on the team. He's been their top target earner on a per route basis essentially every year that he's been with the team. He's gone to Carolina. I like his chances here, Freiermuth, of not just bouncing back, but having a strong year, at least a year where we can trust him in fantasy again. And he was being drafted as tight end 17 when we did the bounce back episode. He's already moved up a spot to tight end 16 since then. I'm going to keep trying to kind of drag that ADP up for Pat here to tight end 14, where I think it belongs. But you tell me why he's maybe a little bit lower on the list for you.
Yeah, I'll try to swat it back down. But first off, I will say he's definitely a talented tight end. All of his per route metrics for us over his career have been fairly good compared to other tight ends. Yeah, he's not among the top 5 or so, but definitely if we were just talking about talent of tight ends, ignoring everything about their situation, who they have as a quarterback, who they're competing with for targets, he'd probably be within the top 10 tight ends for me, just in terms of that. But for me, I am worried about Arthur Smith's offense and how much they like using a lot of tight ends. Because last year was Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, Michael Pruitt, all had over 400 snaps, but no one was the clear number 1 tight end in terms of their role. Parker Hesse led the team in snaps the year before. Hayden Hurst, Lee Smith with 300 plus snaps to go along with Pitts, and that was the 1 year where Pitts was able to be tight end 6. But even going back to his time with the Tennessee Titans, it was a very similar tight end rotation where they had guys that were clear blockers, they had guys who were in between, they had guys who were clear receivers, and it was Jonnu Smith who was having that role of, we hoped that he would break out each year, and he kept on not doing it with the Titans. Jeff Swaim was with those teams, Anthony Firkser, and Michael Pruitt again. And Michael Pruitt at over 400 snaps in 2019 in Arthur Smith's offense. He did it again in 2023. And Michael Pruitt is back with Arthur Smith with Pittsburgh. And that's along with them drafting Darnell Washington in the 3rd round, not this year, but the year before. They also have Connor Hayward, who has significant playing time. I would not be at all surprised if all 4 tight ends played over 300 snaps this season and all had their own roles within the offense. You do make a good point that Freiermuth is a more well-rounded tight end who can stay into pass block That isn't always how he's been used with Pittsburgh, but I think he's at least capable of it. So I think it depends if Arthur Smith views him ahead of all of these other guys in a way that they trust him to be on the field all the time, like we would hope he would be. But I wouldn't be surprised if he is rotating for snaps just like everyone else and not seeing enough snaps in some situations, which won't give him enough pass routes needed to be a fantasy starting tight end.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a concern, right? Like we see we've been frustrated with Arthur Smith in the past, and yeah, I guess that's kind of the way that I'm viewing Pat Freiermuth, is just as a capable tight end, able to play in all those situations where, all the tight ends that you named there before, like none of those guys, I mean, outside of Kyle Pitts, obviously as a receiver, are as particularly special at anything that they do, right? So attacking that position with a committee to try and fill those holes for the offense, I think was probably part of the plan there, where I think Freiermuth can do more with more snaps, and fill the role as one player that three players were playing previous on those other teams. So that's kind of how I'm looking at Freiermuth. But again, like you said, there is absolutely concern there with his usage in the past. But I do tend to think that Freiermuth at least brings a skill set that Arthur Smith is looking for more so than what he had with Kyle Pitts, I guess.
But I do feel like Jonnu Smith sort of fits that kind of well-roundedness as well. And he was the receiver more in Tennessee. In Atlanta, he was like the kind of in-between, playing both as a blocker and a receiver. In his 1 year with the Patriots, he was used more as a blocker. Miami, he should be kind of an everything guy. So he's had someone that is capable of everything with two different teams now, and just kind of... And like he had Delaney Walker for just a little bit, but Walker was used basically exclusively as a receiver, not playing in that run blocking role, even though that's kind of what he was traditionally early on in his career. So I think the preseason could be pretty huge for this year to see what they do if they end up playing their starters. Preseason with tight ends is probably my favorite time, because this is right in the range of tight ends where we're talking about guys that we hope end up breaking out. But then if we see they're not playing enough snaps and they're using kind of their normal tight end rotation, then we at least know that early on in the preseason before most drafts happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for sure. All right. And then rounding out our top 15 is Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. He's going as tight end 14 in ADP. So this leads into kind of our final grouping here. It's a much larger one, so we'll see kind of the biggest discrepancies as we start to kind of take swings at our guys here. Tight end 16 is relatively close, at least with ADP. It's Cole Kmet. He's being drafted as tight end 16, and then we get to tight end 17, Luke Musgrave, who is tight end 17 by ADP. Is that right?
Yep.
Yes, he is. He's tight end 17 by ADP. And then let me see. Hold on one second. I kind of lost my spot here where my players were that I'm talking about. Yeah, Luke Musgrave. So we'll talk about him, I guess, because he's kind of our first discrepancy here among this last later tier. So I have him, like I said, at a little bit earlier than ADP. So I have him as tight end 15. You have him as tight end 18. There's my chart. So let's start with you for this one. Why do you hate Luke Musgrave of your Green Bay Packers?
First off, I think we'll go into some tight end philosophy of like, at this point, why are you drafting a tight end? And it'll depend on the league. But like, we talked about the top 8 guys that we're both in agreement on, with Ingram, Pitts, and Kittle ending that group. If I have one of those 3 guys, I'm probably not drafting a backup tight end in most normal leagues, because even like Pat Freiermuth, we were just talking about Dalton Schultz. I'm not sure if there's a matchup where I'm like, I'm going to bench Kyle Pitts in favor of Dalton Schultz because of the matchups. Most of the time, I'm just going to keep my star tight end in the lineup. And you can even go down and like Jake Ferguson, compared to some of these guys that are in this tier, I'm probably still starting Ferguson even regardless of matchups. So outside of the bye week, a lot of the times I don't need a tight end. So it depends what you're looking for in a tight end. I think if you are looking for someone where they have a chance to be really high, I think Musgrave does stand out in this group because there's that chance. But if you're in a league that for whatever reason starts 2 tight ends, then I'd probably have Musgrave a bit lower. And my concern here is the playing time. Tucker Kraft played decently well. So did Musgrave in their rookie years. So I'm not sure how the snaps will be distributed this year. Musgrave was a clear tight end when he was healthy. Then when he was out, Kraft became the clear tight end, and they seem to trust him more as those games progress. So I think they trust Tucker more than they did at the start of last season. So I could see these two rotating in and out a little bit more. They've also been fine having either a fullback or a tight end that's clearly a blocking tight end. Part of that rotation too, I could see that happening. So it's not just going to be these two tight ends fighting for playing time. There'll be a blocker involved. And they also probably are going to have a decent amount of 3 wide receiver sets because that's when Jaden Reed is on the field. So I'm not sure Musgrave is going to see as much playing time as most of the tight ends that we're going to be talking about in this tier. There's a chance that he just stays clearly ahead of Tucker Kraft, and then he has the opportunity to have a really good season, but still he's competing for targets with at least 4 wide receivers that most people are at least excited about 1 or 2 of them. So chances are either all of them will do decently well, or maybe 1 or 2 of them will end up emerging, but there's a lot of good young talent in Green Bay. They had those 2 drafts where all they did was draft either wide receivers or wide receivers and tight ends. So they have these 6 players that are all within 1 or 2 years apart, and all of them could end up having okay seasons. And Musgrave is just one of those players compared to a lot of tight ends here where they're the clear number 1 tight end, unquestioned player on their team.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like the target competition is not going to be easy for Musgrave, I guess, and I guess he's one of the players for me like that I think can emerge this year as one of their top targets. Like I know Tucker Kraft, he did play well last year, but he also tore his pec this offseason. He had surgery. Doesn't have like a set timetable on return at this point. Like they said, maybe it's training camp, but also maybe not. But either way, like Musgrave, he is out there at least right now, getting back to kind of developing that rapport with Jordan Love in this offense. And, to kind of compare Musgrave and Kraft, like Musgrave, yeah, he was the higher drafted prospect for the Packers last offseason, going in the 2nd round compared to the 3rd round for Kraft. But he was also, I think, better than Kraft when he was on the field last season. Obviously, dealt with injuries himself, missed time. But comparing the two, like from just a per route basis in 2023, Musgrave outperformed him in yards per route run, target rate, deep target rate, and average depth of target for like kind of that higher fantasy value as well. Catchable completion rate on the year. Like even in the playoffs last year, Musgrave was kind of being eased back in after the injury. I think he only came back in like week 18. He played less than Kraft, but he was way more effective, right, at earning targets per route run, yards per route run, and first down touchdown rate per route run as well. Like it wasn't necessarily close. So I think Musgrave, he was their tight end 1 through the first 9 weeks of last season. Kraft wasn't really a factor, like you said, when Musgrave was in the lineup. And I just think that, nothing that Kraft did last year, like I think it was good, but I don't think it was so good that they maybe go back on that bias from the year before. Like not enough, at least, that he doesn't cut into his, I think, top 15 potential for tight end. And that's kind of what I'm banking on for Musgrave, is just having a higher upside in this range. Like you said, like depending on how you treat your draft to start at the tight end position, you may or may not want to try to take another swing at the position here. But if I am taking the swing, Luke Musgrave is definitely one of those guys for me. So I just think, again, profiles is a better receiving option, and some of those higher value fantasy targets that he brings with him as well, because of that profile where he can get down the field, he can work the middle of the field a little bit better, just leads to more fantasy potential for when he is out there. And yeah, maybe Kraft cuts into the snaps a little bit, but I still think that for me, Musgrave is the kind of clear tight end 1 in this offense, and has a shot along with 10 other guys in Green Bay to be at least that second option maybe for whoever comes out as the first, whether it's a Jaden Reed or Christian Watson, whoever.
The one interesting thought I had there is I was writing the Josh Jacobs. I've been doing a bunch of player profiles and writing the Josh Jacobs one recently, and realizing the Packers don't really have a 3rd down back They have a bunch of guys who are very clearly early down backs, and we've seen a couple of teams start to have either a fullback or a tight end play more in the backfield on third downs. We saw the Bengals do that a bit, and then we saw the Vikings as well with CJ Ham. So I'm wondering if the Packers could potentially have both tight ends on the field at times, having one lined up at tight end, one in the backfield, giving both players more opportunities, or maybe we see Jaden Reed in the backfield a little bit more, and then 2 tight end sets to go along with that. But I think there could be some creative things where they get both guys on the field. So maybe it won't always be Kraft taking snaps away from Musgrave, but just both of them on the field at the same time. And with Musgrave, at least so far, being the better receiver, being the one more likely to see targets. But I also don't take a ton of stock in how well tight ends perform in the rookie year, since we've seen plenty of excellent tight ends not really do much as rookies. Even like Dalton Kincaid, he put a bunch of stats together, but he didn't really grade all that well as a receiver. But I'm not all that concerned about that. Like Sam Laporta is the clear exception to the case, and he's our overall tight end 1. So that's also partially why, like, yeah, I have Musgrave ahead of Kraft right now, and especially if there's the health factor, like you mentioned. But I wouldn't be entirely surprised that Kraft ends up being the better receiver of the 2 in the long run. I have Musgrave as the favorite, but it's just an open-ended question to me rather than just a clear Musgrave's the better receiver than Kraft.
Okay. Yep, makes sense. Our next tight end is tight end 18 in our consensus ranks. It's Hunter Henry. You're much higher on Henry than consensus. You have him at tight end 17. He's going as tight end 21. So what do you like about Henry in New England this year to be bullish on him?
A lot of it is simply he's been able to be a starting fantasy tight end before, where a lot of the guys on this list, we had Cole Kmet as one of the guys ahead of him, and like Kmet's done okay, but now he has a ton of competition for targets, and he's never been like a clear top tight end over a long period of time, where Henry has been a top 6 fantasy tight end before. He was tight end 14 last season. A lot of that is just he's been able to stay healthy, and he's receiving tight end. So Henry, I'm high on him, particularly if you're just looking for a handcuff or someone that you can start during a bye week, especially if you're in deeper leagues where it does make more sense to get a backup tight end. They did lose both of his backups on the Patriots last year. Mike Gesicki and Pharaoh Brown both left. They did bring in Austin Hooper, but not too concerned about that. I think if anything, this leads to a little bit more playing time from Henry. And for me, a lot of it's also just his touchdown potential. He scored a decent number of touchdowns at times throughout his career. And if the Patriots offense is able to have a little bit better quarterback play, which we're generally expecting, that could lead to more trips to the end zone, more touchdowns, could get him to the tight end 12 range. But like, if we're discussing Musgrave versus Henry, a lot of it is what you're looking for. I think Musgrave has a much better shot of being a top 6 tight end this year, for example, than Henry. But I think Henry has a better chance of being a top 12 tight end.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a fine way to look at it. For me, yeah, I am like closer, I guess, or lower on Henry than consensus, or at least closer to ADP. And I guess I'm just like not overly sold on him, or maybe even the New England offense. Like I do think like Kendrick Bourne, Demario Douglas, Jalen Polk, Javon Baker, like I'm not like overly high on those guys individually, but I think as a whole, they're going to be probably a better receiving core than they'll get credit for. And I think will be more consistent kind of targets in the offense in New England. And then, yeah, we definitely expect Drake May to be good, or at least better than what they were last year. But not knowing for sure. And then you also have a first-time head coach and a defensive-minded one at that, right, in Gerard Mayo. So he projects as probably the safer option, again, to Luke Musgrave, or kind of the spotty production profile that he probably projects as well, right? Where, you know, he's going to have weeks where he's a top 10 weekly performer because he scores a touchdown, and then maybe a lot more weeks where he's like outside the top 30 or whatever it is, just because of the floor. And I think there are some other capable receiving options there in New England. But yeah, I don't hate Hunter Henry by any means. I just not overly excited about him, I guess. So I guess that's kind of what we're seeing is I'm maybe leaning more into the upside potential for the tight ends versus kind of the safer floors, at least for this early part of the back half of our rankings.
Yeah, and I can live with that the wide receivers play a little bit better because then Henry will get to the red zone more often and hopefully score a little bit more. So, yeah, he's probably like the least exciting tight end in this group. But I think if you're looking for someone who's going to finish in like the 12 to 18 range, and he should finish at least a top 30 tight end most weeks. But
all right, at tight end 19 for us. Apparently, we're back on our BS with Chico Okonkwo because we both have him higher than his consensus tight end 24 ADP. So in for another year on Chiggy, it seems. And then at tight end 20, another difference between the two of us. I have Taysom Hill as tight end 19. You have him as tight end 23. Currently going as tight end 20 in ADP. Finished as tight end 16 in PPR in each of the past 2 seasons. So I guess I'll start with Taysom Hill. So he finished as a top 10 tight end in 50% of his 16 games last year. Isn't necessarily being utilized as a passer as much since Derek Carr had joined the team. But he did set a new career high in targets, receptions, receiving yards. So those numbers, alone weren't anything special with 39, 33, 291. But you combine that with the fact that he had 78 carries for 401 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, knowing that his floor has been, about 54 carries over the past 4 years. I think there's obviously more fantasy potential for Hill than just as a receiver, which is what we've seen from him a lot of times when he's on the field. So he only scored 2 receiving touchdowns, while Jimmy Graham, of all people, who isn't on the team anymore, scored 4 from the tight end position for the Saints last year. I like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed for this year, but like even if you mix in a Juwan Johnson in there, who I think you have higher on him, so that'll kind of maybe be the discussion. I don't think it's a bad room for Hill to kind of make his mark again as a third receiving option, like tight end 19 to 20, kind of a good spot for him, for me at least. I know, again, like you like Johnson more, but even getting targeted at a higher rate than Hill last year, Juwan Johnson, like Hill still outperformed him in PPR points per game, yards per route run. It just like was a better and more effective player, better arguably receiver as well, on top of what he adds as a runner, and that they're willing to use him, I think, in goal to go situations as well, was really encouraging for me. He had 10 goal to go carries last year. That was tied with Lamar Jackson and behind only Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen among like the non-running backs. So I think there is something to be said about the team liking him in those scoring situations, and over Juwan Johnson as well, who's he saw a higher target rate in goal to go situations over Johnson, 50% to 25% as well, when they were close to scoring position. So if he's one of their go-to players for goal line packages, like, and they've kind of shown that tendency recently, and most importantly, more so than Juwan Johnson, that's why I kind of give the edge to Taysom Hill this year again.
For me, a big part of it is the change in offensive coordinator. They had Pete Carmichael as the offensive coordinator from 2009 to 2023. And I'm not sure if there's really that many other coaches or offensive coordinators that would be doing the stuff with Taysom Hill that the Saints have been doing all these years. But now they have a new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak, who hasn't been around the Saints. So I would not be surprised if they're like, we're not going to use a 34-year-old player at running back anymore. There's no 34-year-old running backs in the league right now. That's not a thing anymore. So I don't see Hill getting those rushing opportunities anymore. And he did set career highs in receiving stuff this past year, but I don't see him getting used all that much as a receiver. Like a lot of his decent games last year were when there were injuries, either to running back or to tight end, and they had a number of running backs out at time, and then Juwan Johnson missed time last season, and that's a lot of the time when Hill ended up getting used more. So I'm just not sure if a new offensive coordinator is going to decide, hey, Hill is going to be a big part of our offense when like there's not what Travis Kelce is around that age, but outside of that, there's not really any other tight ends that are receiving. Mercedes Lewis is much older, but he's a run blocking tight end at this time. But there's just not players at his age doing that stuff. And if the people that have been at the bat for Hill for year after year after year are no longer with the team, then I'm not sure Hill has a role in the offense. But it's like, if we're talking risky and not risky, and like Hunter Henry was the safest option out of all these guys we're talking about, Hill is the riskiest because, like, we've seen it before. They could use him in the run game and the pass game, and you could get a running back at the tight end position like we've seen before, and then he's a top 12 tight end, and that's great. But I think out of all these guys, like, everyone else has at least a very safe path to significant playing time. Hill, I could see a scenario where he's not on the roster this year, and then he's probably on the Broncos roster and then does even better than this. His best case scenario is probably getting traded to Denver. That's my take here.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, that would make sense with Sean Payton, right? So, yeah, and that's kind of how I've been treating this part of the ranks, like within the top 20 is weighing more of the high upside for those guys right before the Hunter Henry safe pick, right? And that's where a lot of these guys kind of sorted out for me. And Taysom Hill, like you said, definitely comes with a lot more risk and does come with the upside as well. If they do decide, like, yeah, this is how we're going to use him. He's got this athletic ability and he's still in great shape and can do all these things. But if they don't, then yeah, absolutely, he's a bust. But tight end 19, like where he's being drafted, it doesn't cost anything really to take that risk either. So that's why I kind of wanted to put him in that kind of range there. At tight end 21 for us, it is Tyler Conklin of the New York Jets. He's going as tight end 23. And then tight end 22 is for us is Juwan Johnson, who is, again, as much as I like Hill more than him, we're both still higher on Johnson than consensus, where he's tight end 28. You have him as tight end 21. I have him as tight end 22. Anything else you want to add on Johnson that we maybe haven't already?
Oh, yeah. Like, I know he suffered the injury recently. It sounds like he's going to be okay, but I wouldn't be surprised if the injury drove down his ADP quite a bit. For me, it's a similar thing of, like, you were mentioning the competition for targets for either one of them. The Saints not having as much at wide receiver this season, so that kind of opens the door at tight end. And, like, the Saints, part of the thing as well with having Pete Carmichael as the offensive coordinator and Sean Payton as the head coach for so long is they rotated their players in and out a ton, and that was true at tight end. And I wouldn't be surprised if Johnson is more of that clear number one tight end going forward. So I could see him having more playing time this year, assuming he does get healthy. And then the touchdown potential has always been there. That's been the main reason to like Johnson for the last couple of years, is his ability to score touchdowns. And then Jimmy Graham was there last year. Wouldn't be entirely surprised if Jimmy Graham just shows up like start of September ready to go. But still, I see Johnson having the potential to score touchdowns and a bigger role in the offense. So that's why if we're talking about the tight ends here, like, I'm still, all these guys we're talking about, I'm not drafting in most leagues, but if I need a backup tight end, or I'm starting two tight ends, or it's tight end premium, then Johnson's someone that I could be a little bit more excited about.
Fair. Yeah, that's pretty much what it is for me. Like, just overall PPR potential, I still think he holds some value there, considering just kind of the lack of other legitimate receiving options on the team. Again, like Olave and Shaheed, but for specific targets and things like that go, I think there's at least a good chance he finishes as the third option on the team there. All right, a couple more names to go over here quickly to round out our top 24 consensus ranks. At tight end 23 for us, at ADP as well. Actually, I don't know what his ADP was. I missed where I put that, but it is Cade Otton. Oh, sorry, tight end 18 is ADP. You love tight end Cade Otton. He's going as tight end 18. You have him as tight end 19. I am as tight end 23. Maybe I'm a bit too low here. Can you make a case for Cade Otton in Tampa Bay this year?
Yeah, well, we're both at least slightly lower than him than consensus here. So not sure me loving him is quite, I just don't dislike him as much as you dislike him. But for me, he was tight end 20 last year. So this is right around the same range that he was at. He's still only 25 years old. So there's still time for him to improve. This is around the time where we start seeing tight ends have a bit of improvement. So I think there's still the opportunity for that for him to get better, unlike Tyler Conklin, someone that we both had in this range as well. Like, we know what Tyler Conklin is at this point and what he's capable of doing. Yeah, there's a chance he does better with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, but he's not going to become this great tight end at this point in his career, where Cade Otton, there is that chance that he improves. And like, they added a tight end in the 7th round, but he doesn't really have any new competition for targets. Yeah, they added rookie wide receiver, but I don't think that's going to take away from the tight end targets for him as well. So I think he just has the opportunity to improve from what he's been doing, and he was tight end 20. So I do think he can get a little bit better than that, and he has a chance to do a lot better than that because he could break out as a player.
Yeah, for sure. I think, there's definitely the potential for a big leap in overall play and production. Cause I guess for me, like, I just don't really believe in him too much as a player. Like, I just don't really like the player that much. Like, 3.9 targets per game last year wasn't overly exciting, but maybe the 2 playoff games are better indicators for what he could be. But again, like, it's just a super small sample size of 2 games from last season. But like, again, the rest of the year, just kind of a guy. 54.1 receiving grade, that ranked 41st at the position. 0.80 yards per route run, that ranked 42nd. He got like a lot of playing time, but really just kind of underwhelmed considering the amount of snaps that he played. Second most routes for the position, and came away with 7 PPR points per game, which ranked 25th at the position. So again, maybe he'll be the playoff version we saw for those 2 games. Maybe that's the indicator for the breakout, but again, it's a small sample size and not enough to go off for me right now. But again, at least an increase in production, I think, is possible. And then last name on our list here, and least as well, I guess. Tight end 24 for us is Zach Ertz of the Washington Commanders. Hated by ADP at the moment as tight end 37 on Sleeper. I thought maybe I missed something where like he left the planet or something like that, or got injured again. But nope, people just hate him. And Nate, you're lower on him as well. Tight end 28. You don't hate him as much as the ADP does at the very least. But I have him as tight end 18. Only because I think there's still enough kind of left in the tank there to provide some spot starts for us in 2024. And again, I don't think he's like completely washed yet. Like, he's definitely getting older, and it's a big part of the concern, but I don't mind Zach Ertz for one more year, right? Like, they drafted Ben Sinnott, who kind of has this cult following of people who seem to think he's going to be the next big thing at the position. And maybe he will, but I just don't see it in year 1 in this offense. And nothing about his college profile screams that he's going to hit the ground running as a rookie. 1.61 career yards per route run. That was 59th percentile among tight end prospects since 2018. 77.6 career receiving grade. That was 64th percentile. Even his best career yards per route run season was 2.02. That was 63rd percentile. So there were even talks about Sinnott being like a fullback at one point. So I'm not like overly concerned about him in year 1. And then you factor in Ertz, who has some familiarity with Cliff Kingsbury, the new offensive coordinator for Washington, has had some success in that offense at the end of 2021 and into 2022. He had 10.6 and 11.6 points per game in those 2 seasons. 2023 wasn't his best showing. Obviously, he's getting older, 7.4 points per game, but he was still earning targets at a decent rate, even if, that started to tail off before his injury and McBride emerging, right? He still finished with a 22.6% target rate. That was a top 5 mark among tight ends through the first 7 games of the year last year. It seems to be healthy now. And I think, you look at the Washington receiving core, basically Terry McLaurin is the only one true sure thing in that receiving core. And Ertz maybe is the second best option, even if he looks like the 33-year-old old man that he is doing it. Like, tight end 18, sure, probably a bit high, right? But I don't know that there's like any truly attractive fantasy tight ends that I'm ranking after him either that I'd rather have, like the Chig Okonkwo's, Tyler Conklin's, Hunter Henry's. They're higher in our consensus ranks, but honestly feel like they have just as low of floors as Ertz. Maybe not nearly, outside of maybe Henry. That's probably the one that I could afford to swap there, but just maybe not as much upside if we do get one more healthy season out of Ertz and he earns targets the way he did prior to his injury. I mean, he was 6 targets per game last year, 1.4 red zone targets per game. Like those are top 10 marks. Not looking for top 5 or top 10 again. I have him as about 4.5 targets per game with red zone looks and playing time, red zone looks, overall targets. That's where the large majority of his fantasy value came from last year. I think he can still at least give us a percentage of that in 2024 on that offense, which may look very similar to Kingsbury and Kyler Murray's Arizona with that mobile quarterback and average options outside of the clear wide receiver one. So I don't know. Am I too optimistic about this old man?
First off, being optimistic about old men, you forgot Austin Eckler and the receiving players that Washington has. Clearly one of the best receiving options for the Washington Commanders. So I think it does fit the philosophy that you've had so far with your rankings of like, here are the guys that have a chance to be really good, but there's also a decent chance that they won't be really good. I did write about Ertz in my sleeper tight ends for the season for a similar reason to a lot of what you were saying is like, for a lot of these tight ends, you don't really see a path to a potential elite season, but the path is there for Ertz because he has that experience in this offense. And last time we've seen him in this offense, he was among the top 6 fantasy tight ends. He's just a lot older, and like any article that you read on him, it sounds like a lot of it was like, hey, let's go teach other people on this team this offense from a player. Like all the headlines I'm seeing right now is using experience to help Commanders on the offense. He wants to mentor and guide the Commanders young tight ends and is basically being a leader on the team, which is great for the Commanders. But it also, like, all of that reads to me of like, they're not going to use him in a full-time role, even if Ben Sinnott plays more of that, like H-back, moves around a little bit more. They also have other young tight ends on the roster that can play at times and did a lot whenever Logan Thomas wasn't healthy. So they have experienced young tight ends on the roster too, that I could see this being a bit of a rotation at the position. And anytime you have a rotation at tight end, then you don't want to start any of them because there's just not enough routes and targets to go around. So part of me having him this low is like, I don't even know if he's going to be the starter because he might not be. It could be their second round rookie that gets a start. And right. I think that's what a lot of people are thinking with the ADP is for them, it's already a foregone conclusion that Ertz is going to be a backup sooner rather than later. But like what we saw in Arizona is he was great until Trey McBride took over, and it made complete sense for McBride to take over with how well he was playing.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's a risky swing, right? But like I still think there's a little bit of gas left in the tank here for him to be a fantasy starter, just based on what he was able to show last year before the injury. Whether he's going to be the same player or not, or like you said, if he's just there for basically being a tight end coach at this point in his career, then again, it's a swing to take. But it's also like a low risk swing for where he's being drafted right now, especially at his ADP. You do not need to draft him as tight end 18. You could wait for a lot later than that. So, yeah. Anyways, that is going to do it. It was a fun conversation here going over the tight end position, which doesn't always provide us with a lot of excitement. But again, I think the position has got a lot stronger over the last year or so. And that makes for a lot more interesting conversations around these players. So thank you all for tuning in. If you're watching on the YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe as well. We'd greatly appreciate that. Nate, thank you to you as well for sharing your ranks, talking through them with us here so we can sort out the position for 2024. And before you go, let us know some of the stuff that you got going on over at pff.com.
Okay, so last week, this week, and next week, a lot of similar kind of articles. Once these 3 weeks are done, I will have position rankings for all the positions. I will have the perfect draft strategy for 12-team leagues for picks 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9, 10 through 12, as well as a general strategy for both 12 and 10-team leagues. I will have PPR rankings, half PPR. I think standard is the third one I'm doing for next week. I am doing player profiles 3 a day, every day from basically now until the start of the season. So those started on Monday. And I wrote a good 12 of them yesterday. So I don't remember which ones are going out what days, but that's for the editors to worry about at this point. Last week also did some studies that I spent a bit of time with in May and June looking at player utilization. So if you're into that kind of stuff and some of the philosophy of me doing the recap articles I do, and I talk about players either losing or gaining playing time in different situations, and that research does a lot to say what that actually means when that happens to a player.
Nice. Yeah, good stuff there. Definitely check out Nate's work, obviously, on pff.com. As for me, I'm covering all the breakout candidates, or my breakout candidates this week. Quarterback and running back are up on the site as of Wednesday. Wide receiver and tight end will be up to close out the week as well. Tight end will include some names that we didn't go into detail about today, so be sure to check that out as well. I'll be back on Friday in the feed for the IDP crowd, talking IDP breakout candidates with my guy Jace Abbey. And then Nate and I will maybe be back next week with something. We don't know exactly how that will work yet, but we'll figure out something. So until then,